Welcome to the Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast, where 𝐊𝐞𝐲 Kumar of Document 360 finds the best SaaS self-service knowledge bases in the world and then interviews their creators. Let's get started with today's episode.
Good day, everyone. Our guest today is Tom Johnson, Senior Technical Writer at Amazon. Tom has been writing professionally since 2002 and shares his extensive technical writing knowledge on his blog, iwouldratherberewriting.com. So welcome, Tom, to Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on this podcast. I'm always excited about different conversations, and I like podcasts in general. So this should be good.
Super. So let's get started now, Tom. And here are the questions we'll move through during the interview. So just to understand a little bit more about yourself and get everything into context, please explain a bit more about you. And we'll talk a lot about your blog, but just a quick introduction to you, a little bit more than what I introduced, Tom.
Sure. I'm based in Sunnyvale, California. Work at Amazon in the App Store side of the business. I've been in tech comm since 2005, and my blog, I'd Rather Be Writing, is where a lot of people know me. I also have an API documentation course that gets a lot of visits and popularity. I present and so forth at different conferences and events, and generally like to engage with the community. I like learning and reflecting and writing. So that's a little bit about me.
Super. So how did it all started, Tom? How did you initially got into documentation?
Yeah, so I actually have a humanities background like many people. I majored in English. I got a master's in creative writing. I thought I was going to be like a writer for magazines or something, some kind of person writing essays and so forth for publications. Steered into teaching writing. I taught for a couple of years at the American University in Cairo, teaching like Writing 101 to students there. And then when I came back to the US, I started working as a marketing copywriter for like a very low salary. And eventually I had a reality check moment where the financial realities of life, especially having a family with children, just started to hit me. And I remember one time I actually had a second job teaching writing at like ITT Tech just to make ends meet. And as I was driving to the second job on a Friday evening after working at my regular job, I sort of just had this moment where I was kicking myself for not choosing a more lucrative career. Eventually, I steered into technical writing because it's much more financially viable. It's like it pays well. But then I realized, and I had resisted it for so long because I just thought it would be boring. But it turns out that technical writing is not boring. It's actually quite interesting. And there are many, many facets that people often don't consider. Everything from the tools side of it to the technology teams and other interactions with these Scrum groups and so forth at work. So it's a multidimensional career that is pretty exciting. So I wish I had given it a little more attention earlier before coming to that reality check moment where I suddenly had to course correct just to stay afloat.
Super. Thank you for being so frank. So what's the current size of your documentation team?
We have just 2 writers. It's me and my colleague who are technical writers, but we're part of a developer relations group that includes some marketers, some other kind of program manager people. And we plug in through business development and there are other field engineers and sister groups and so forth. Anyway, there are a lot of different teams, different writing teams at my company. Some teams are huge, like the AWS team is huge, but there are other teams that are just like a lone writer, part of a engineering team. And I kind of like being part of a small group because it's easier to make decisions. You can experiment with something on the fly. You don't have to get collective buy-in from 20 different writers before you make a change. I like that flexibility a little more.
Super. So what is your documentation process and who do you normally involve in such processes?
I like this question because as I've kind of listened to the responses from other podcasts, I haven't seen the answer I'm going to give emphasize as much. As far as processes go, we generally try to follow an agile process, specifically Scrum, because that's pretty much what the engineers at an organization follow. Scrum is extremely common, and it tends to work when you're marching in the same rhythm as engineers. In a nutshell, that process is basically to divide your work up into 2-week sprints or so. Figure out what you're going to work on in that 2-week chunk. Create tickets for each of the tasks. And when you're done with this 2 weeks, you kind of share out what you have accomplished. And this last part is actually probably the most impactful. When you send out an email to all stakeholders saying, hey, we updated X, Y, and Z in the docs, or this is new, people really appreciate that. And you become more visible. It's sort of the sprint demo. But it's complicated to try to always adopt a Scrum workflow. We have both our own documentation Scrum with just my colleague and me, but we also try to plug into engineering Scrums when we have a larger project. So right now I'm working on one large project with a group, and I try to plug into their engineering process, and they have their own Jira space, their own sprint dates and so forth. And I'll put all my doc tasks in their sprint. But then we also have other stuff outside of that project, right? So I will group those in a different space. And unfortunately, there are multiple ticketing systems. So this other space is a homegrown ticketing system. Mm-hmm. The other hard part is that a lot of times technical writers don't get counted the same as engineers on a Scrum. Like the tasks might not receive points. They might not say, okay, you have a max of 10 points for this sprint. We're not going to over allocate you. And some people may change what your priorities should be halfway through without really respecting the sort of plan you had at the beginning of the sprint. So you have to be flexible, but in part that flexibility is required because most technical writers are partially allocated resources to teams. You bounce around to multiple teams, and your work is not always needed, right? You're only needed when there's something to document, and that might not be until the product has reached a certain point. So you have to be flexible in how you integrate into Scrum processes. But in general, we found that Scrum works well. Now, the other process that we follow, which isn't Scrum related, but is a review process that I've found to be extremely helpful. We have 5 stages of review that we've formalized. Once we write docs, we review them within our own team. I really try to test the instructions, make sure I can get them to work and I'm comfortable with them. Then I expand the review out to the product team. This is usually all the engineers on the team and the product owner who are responsible for this feature or product. After that, I expand the review out to field engineers and support to get their input. At each iteration, I'm actually making changes so that the content is improving. The 4th stage is to review it with the legal group. They usually don't have a lot of input, but sometimes they do, especially if there are like SDKs being released that need licenses or other kind of attributions. And then the 5th stage is to review the content with beta partners. Usually before release, you have some people testing it out and they will have input as well. When I can push content through these 5 stages and make changes along the way at each stage, it tends to result in pretty good content by the end. I also really try to champion sample apps as part of this process. It just helps people adopt the product as well as helps us test it. But that review process is one that I really champion, in part because like our role, even if you don't write content, if you just take content that engineers write and move it through this process, you can have a tremendous impact on the product. And one of our roles as technical writers is to sort of convene these different groups around the review. And anyway, I'm a big believer in that. So anyway, that's mostly our process.
Fantastic. That's as you said, I don't remember hearing these two techniques very often for this question. Yeah. Please share your understanding of the 𝐊𝐞𝐲 school of thought.
Thanks. I'm glad that we can dive into this because this is definitely something that's a prominent theme I've seen. 𝐊𝐶𝐲 code refers to treating documentation like software developers treat code in a loose kind of way, not exactly the same. But generally, there are 5 characteristics that define a 𝐊𝐶𝐲 code workflow. The format tends to be a lightweight markup format, such as Markdown. The content management method is usually Git or some other version control. The way you deploy is usually a CI/CD or continuous integration, continuous deployment method, where you push content to the server, usually through Git, and the build kicks off on the server. You usually have a text editor such as Atom or Visual Studio Code, and you usually compile or build your content through a static site generator. Now, there are varying degrees to which people adopt these characteristics. Some check all the boxes, some check a few, but that sort of characterizes the 𝐊𝐶𝐲 code approach. I did a recent developer survey trying to gauge what tools, what processes people followed. And about 22% of people are using static site generators. And by people, I mean 22% of people who are writing for developer audiences. That's the limit, the segmentation limit of this survey. 14% of people used wikis, 11% used internally built tools, and 11% used XML editing tools. The most common source format was Markdown, 37% of people using Markdown. 56% of people follow 𝐊𝐶𝐲 code, and 67% of people manage their content in Git. So among the community that writes docs for developers, this is a pretty common method and approach that people take. Well, one thing I found surprising is that when you ask people what tool they use for their docs, it's not a straightforward answer anymore. People use a variety of tools in this workflow. There's a concept called, or a term called Jamstack that refers to this JavaScript API Markdown sort of concatenation of tools to achieve a result. I found that a lot of people, they treat Markdown almost like a standard. Maybe you generate Markdown, you generate your docs from Markdown using a script. You work in a certain editor. You build it using custom internal tools. It goes through other workflows. There's no single tool that handles authoring, review, publishing all in one package. It's sort of fragmented across a lot of different tools for different needs. And I find that interesting. I've used a lot of different tools in the past. I've used help authoring tools, wikis, XML authoring tools, web-based content management systems. And I do like the 𝐊𝐶𝐲 code approach because it is so flexible, but it does have kind of pros and cons about it.
All right, great. So, what are the advantages or disadvantages of dogs as code approach?
Yeah. So, and this is where I wanted to dive into the pros and cons. The cons, I've sort of talked a little bit about the pros, but I'll get into that more. The cons are that you can spend a lot of time configuring and developing the tools. You kind of need a UX skill set if you're going to build your doc site from scratch. You can use some existing themes, but you'll want to modify them and tweak them. A lot of times these tools are missing search. It's almost the default that search isn't included, and that's really where the expense is, because even if you adopt an open source static site generator, when you want to integrate search, you're looking at an extra 6 to 10K a year, depending upon how much content you have. And that's an additional integration as well. This internal development time shouldn't be discounted. I mean, if you're spending a quarter of your time just figuring out your tool set, that's a huge loss of bandwidth that you often don't get credit for. People assume that, I don't know, the doc tools just come completely configured out of the box, and they don't realize all the time it takes. And finally, these static site generators are often geared towards general web publishing, so they don't really consider tech comp scenarios very well. A few common scenarios that get overlooked. Content reuse, especially with variables, isn't always straightforward. Localization, the workflows are just not there for most of the tools. PDF generation, you really have to implement, different approaches. I use Prince XML to do it. We get around this. Like, we localize, we reuse content, we generate PDF, but we've had to be creative in the way we figure it out. And then finally, these tools really lend themselves to a lot of custom scripting. You can use that they have different scripting languages. Jekyll allows you to use liquid markup and so forth, which is it's kind of like JavaScript made easy. But as soon as you start doing a lot of custom scripting, you get locked into that tool. It becomes very difficult to migrate, because now you have to figure out how you're going to write those same scripts in the other tool's scripting language and so forth. Anyway, the pros, the good parts, the advantages are that they're open source, so they're free and easy to sort of get started. They can scale up because nobody needs proprietary licenses. You can just have engineers clone the project, open up their favorite text editor, and make pull requests. You have complete flexibility and freedom to do what you want. You can implement different frameworks. We use Bootstrap, and I like to implement navigation tabs to kind of show and hide different content. And the output is usually a modern looking website. If you've put the right UX in there, it can look like it belongs on the web rather than kind of an outdated tri-pane help.
Great, thank you. So I know you have written extensively on the topic of the value of technical writers and documentation. So why do metrics often fall short here?
I'm glad that we're diving into the metrics, because this is a part of my blog. I did explore this topic quite a bit at one point, and I haven't talked about it for a while. But there are usually people want metrics for a couple of different reasons. One, maybe you need justification for hiring. If your team is always low on bandwidth, you need to make the case that your team should expand, and you need metrics to justify that. Or another scenario is that managers, they just want to understand your work, your productivity, and they can't do that without having some kind of quantifiable form of metrics. Problem is, metrics usually fall apart. The research in this area has generally concluded that metrics are not uniform across the industry. They're not widely used, or if they are used, they're not like there's not an overwhelming pattern. Saul Carliner has some great research on this, where he's one of the academic and industry sort of rock stars, and he has some great content on this. But let's look at a classic example. Okay, so just really kind of make this case that metrics are problematic. The most common example around metrics is to say that tech docs can deflect support costs, and therefore you can measure the sort of value of tech docs around the amount that has been saved from support costs. So problem number one, Ginny Reddish explains that a lot of times support and tech docs are in totally different groups with different budgets that don't overlap and often don't even communicate. So right off the bat, it's hard to, have one group be excited about reducing the support costs when costs are coming from different buckets and different parts of the org. But then the other problem is around data collection. How do you know if a support agent used docs to solve a ticket? Maybe the support agent read the docs a long time ago, ramped up, gained knowledge. Now they don't know or even realize that they're using docs to the knowledge they learned from docs to solve tickets, or it's just maybe they are using it, they're not even noting it. Maybe they're pointing customers to docs, but you have to somehow note that in the ticket and then quantify that. Another problem is that how do you know if the ticket was never even created, the support ticket was never created because the customer already found the answer before contacting support? Maybe they searched on Google, found your site, found the answer, never called support. How do you measure the customers who maybe turned down your project because of the documentation? This is a huge cost, and this might be more applicable in DevRel scenarios where you're onboarding partners. Maybe they interacted with the docs, formed the conclusion that integration was too cumbersome, and then decided to go a different route, costing the company, I don't know, whatever the impact of that potential integration would have been. And then there's the reverse. What if the partner is hesitant to sign a contract, looks at the docs, agrees that the integration is going to be fairly simple, signs a contract, and it brings your company millions? Like, how do you quantify that? There are a lot of different ways. How about the scenario where you have internal engineers who are onboarding onto the team, the project? They go through all the docs and they ramp up. Like, that's a huge amount of time that you saved the company by not requiring other engineers to handle them through the product. How does that get quantified? Or I don't know. There's a lot of different dimensions, and when people kind of do math, I don't find it very persuasive. Even if you do quantify something and you say, okay, docs reduced 100 support tickets a month, and each support ticket costs the org $100, and so we save the company $10,000 a month. I just don't think that a lot of people find math all that persuasive, because there's so many different potential cause and effect discrepancies and other factors. What Saul Carliner concluded from looking at metrics was that word of mouth tends to be most persuasive. And I definitely find that the case as well. If somebody hears from a couple of different customers that, hey, the docs suck, and we want them to look more like this other company's, it's very easy for people to arrive and generalize at a larger conclusion that, hey, our docs are poor, or the reverse. Another person who's written a lot about measurement is Bob Watson, and he has pointed out that you really can only measure the impact of docs if you have a before and after scenario with and without docs. For example, you launch a product and you don't have any documentation for it, you can probably gauge the impact as soon as you add docs at a later point. Granted, usually upon release, that's when you get the most customer queries. So it's not night and day, but generally when you remove docs, you see the real impact. Every once in a while, tech doc sites go down and people freak out. I kind of actually like it when this happens. Our doc site doesn't go down much, but when docs are not available for a product due to some technical glitch, you can really see that like people stress out, and suddenly the impact is very apparent. So anyway, in a nutshell, Measurement, I definitely support it. I don't mean to detract from the effort, but it's very difficult. And word of mouth tends to be what people rely on.
Wow, that's that's great. So what is the best way to measure usage of documentation, Tom?
Yeah, usage now follows in with metrics in a good way. A lot of people use analytics like Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics packages to measure documentation. But here again, it gets tricky because for a number of different reasons. One is that not all sort of users have the same impact on the business. And this is probably more true in a DevRel situation. But imagine if you have, let's say you're onboarding different partners. Let's say you're Roku or something, and you have 100 people who have cat video apps, right? And you're trying to onboard them. But you have one person who's like a Netflix or a very popular video streaming service. In those scenarios, which metrics in terms of like traffic to the docs mean more, right? I think you'd rather have that one popular video streaming service rather than 100 cat video apps. And that's the case that's the problem with traffic. If you have 100 hits on a topic, but those 100 hits are from very important partners that are adding a lot of value to your business, it might be more valuable than 10,000 hits from random people who don't impact your business. So that's part of the problem. It's also very difficult to just sort of draw conclusions that are meaningful from metrics. For example, time on page. If you have 1 minute on the page versus 5 minutes, what kind of conclusion can you draw from that? Maybe it takes 5 minutes to read it from end to end, but it would only take 30 seconds to scan down to a certain paragraph that might have the answer. Bounce rate is also problematic, right? If somebody jumps onto one page and then leaves your site, that's usually how you define a bounce rate. Did they find the answer? Did they not find the answer? It's difficult to tell. Another confusing sort of metric is measuring how many pages a person visited while on your site. If somebody visits 3 to 4 pages, is that better than somebody who visits 2 pages? Maybe you have shorter topics that require people to click around more, or maybe you have processes broken out across a lot of different steps, or maybe the material is just confusing and people have to revisit it a lot and click to different areas to fully understand it. It's very difficult to draw any kind of conclusions from metrics around usage. What I do pay attention to, however, is trending pages.
Okay.
I know in my docs that some pages are trending consistently. We have a specifications page that I found is always at the top of the list in hits. So I do focus a lot more attention on that because I just get the sense that it's important to a lot of different people. And I found that these specification pages were actually the source of truth for both internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders. And so I put a little more attention on that. But again, it's really hard to divide your time based on metrics.
True. Great. So do you think, can technical writers create value for internal groups within an organization? If yes, then how? How is it possible, you think?
One of the great articles I've read on this is from somebody named Michael Hughes, who has since retired, but he argued that TechCom's biggest benefit is really around knowledge creation. And knowledge is the lifeblood of a lot of these IT organizations. He says that technical communicators, they really, they're articulating what experts can't really articulate and which others might not even know to ask. You're creating information that other people are using. The information didn't necessarily exist before. Maybe it's trapped inside of an expert's head. They can't communicate it. Or maybe you're synthesizing things and you're making creating new forms of knowledge that make it possible for so many different other parts of the organization to operate. Everybody from different engineering teams who need to consume the knowledge, to business development people who need to onboard prospective engineers, to just, internal support agents who need training, to PMs who want to understand things better. So definitely this knowledge creation is a huge sort of value that we add when we're developing information. And this is, again, hard to quantify, hard to really, hard to measure. And a lot of people don't really acknowledge the impact that we have, that technical writers have with knowledge creation.
Mm-hmm. So how involved do you think a technical writer be in the customer experience?
This is another great question. Most people do believe that technical writers should be user champions, that this is a role we should play, that we should be the voice of the customer, bringing back insights to engineering teams, helping shape and design the product. And definitely the more customer insights you have, the more valuable you become to so many different parts of the organization. The problem is it's very hard to have that constant interaction with customers if you're not interacting and interfacing with customers. Traditionally, the support groups and the field engineers interface most with customers. So you have to go out of your way as a technical writer to mine information from these groups. Surprisingly, a lot of times support teams won't even tell you what trending issues they're experiencing or what the customer's point of view is, unless there's like an overwhelming gap that they're pointing out. And field engineers are the same. They don't just arrive at your door saying, "Oh, hey, customers said X, Y, and Z." Maybe they'll communicate that to a PM when there's a big gap in the feature set. But in general, you have to mine support logs. You have to go out of your way to pull information from field engineers' heads. And so it becomes an extra step that a lot of times technical writers just don't have the bandwidth for. But the impact is that if you don't have these insights and this customer information, writing tech docs is more challenging because you don't have strong knowledge about your audience, right? If you don't know who your audience is, how do you know how to shape the material? So anyway, yes, a technical writer should be very closely attuned to the customer experience, but we're not always positioned in a way that there's a natural flow from the customer experience to tech comm.
So do you think they should be involved in high-level strategy or just be responsible for writing clear documentation?
Well, a lot of people definitely do want to be involved in high-level strategy. Technical writers want a seat at the design table. They want to be more influencers in how products are formed before they're already cemented. But like I said, in order to get that seat at the design table, you have to sort of saturate your knowledge, or you have to gather a lot of customer insights. So if you want to take that route and you want to be a design influencer, there's definitely an opportunity, but you might have to do it yourself. Like you might have to go out of your way doing an extra job to gather all this information. You could spend hours, for example, looking through support logs on your own, right? So yeah, some people don't really care about that. Like sitting at the design table, they could care less. They're like, give me the product 1 month before release when it's gone through all of its iterations and it's settled down, and I'll document it and move on. So there's different interests and different opportunities to specialize in different areas in tech comm, and some people are really into design and usability, and there's definitely a space for that.
That's really great, Tom. So you explained everything quite detailed, and now it's time for our rapid fire round. Who have you learned the most about documentation from in your career?
One of my favorite people in tech comm has to be Mark Baker. He had a blog called Every Page is Page One. And he's since retired, but I really enjoyed it when he was in his active blogging days. He really brought a lot of like deep insights, and I loved reading just the way he wrote and just his ability to think deeply on topics. He really consolidated some great advice into this mantra of every page is page one that had a huge impact on the community. I mean, a lot of people really started to think more deeply about how to write for the web, about the dynamics of the web, and how people read and consume information on the web. So I definitely liked Mark Baker, and it's always sad when somebody moves in another direction when they retire, but he definitely had a huge impact on me.
Super. So I'm 100% sure you read and write a lot, but can you share a documentation related resource you have consumed recently?
Sure. I was recently experimenting with a new podcast editor called Descript, Descript, which is a really interesting sort of thing because it links your audio file with a transcript. And if you start editing the transcript, it in turn edits the audio, which is really kind of cool. And I had questions while using this. So I sort of dove into their help and realized that it was like a different style. They sort of chunked everything up into bite-sized questions. And it was a knowledge-based sort of delivery where you just have hundreds of topics that are each like half a page long with maybe a screenshot and just answers a specific question. Made me realize that the docs I write tend to have more user flows that are sort of beginning to end experiences. A lot of the stuff that tech writers write are more like thorough. They're more just descriptive of a larger process. Another tutorial, I have to say, my favorite tutorials, a different product, is probably this guy who's got a site called Cave of Programming, where he's teaching programming. I loved this guy's tutorials because when he would teach a principle, he would open up like an IDE and sort of dynamically go through an example of that with some small snippet of code and run it to show it. And it was super instructive. I think I was learning Java or something through this tutorial site. So there are a lot of different methods. Like not all products have the same method for delivering information. You know, if Descript used that same principle of showing little samples in the output, it might not fit sort of the information needs of that product. So those are just a couple of examples.
Okay, so I'm very excited to hear what you have for this question. What is the one piece of documentation related advice you would give to your 20-year-old self?
I think I would flip this question around and try to ask, what is the one piece of advice that my 20-year-old self would give to me right now? Because I'm 44. So why would I flip this around? Well, I kind of feel like as I get older, I'm a little more cautious and hesitant to take risks and embrace different changes, like switching jobs to some new role or even moving apartments. It's like I sort of feel like I'm just more cautious about everything. I'm not really sure why. I think when I was younger, I was a little more reckless, a little more open to different directions, more open to just moving forward down some path without understanding where it's going. And I think definitely having more of a mentality of risk taking and opening yourself up to complete failures if it's a bad decision or something is a good mindset. And it's hard to keep that as you get older, because I think people realize the impact of a bad decision. And so it's harder to make decisions that don't have known ends. But that's the advice I'd give, is to kind of open myself up to more risk.
Okay, that's fair enough. Thank you so much, Tom. Before we finish this podcast recording, do you have anything more to add to our audience?
Not really. I think that the podcasts you're creating are great. I mean, one of the things I do like about your approach and the product is this effort to merge the gap between knowledge bases and documentation, because this has really been an ongoing gap in the industry for too long. The fact that we have separate bodies of information, separate sort of roles that are one writing knowledge base articles, one writing documentation, and really bringing those two together is a good thing for organizations. So I like this focus, and I like a lot of the other podcasts and the trend you're moving in.
Thank you, Tom. I think all the credit should go to our guests as well, because they are willing to join this podcast series and share their experience and help anyone who wants to take this as a serious career. So, all we are doing is just organizing it, but everything else should go to guests like yourself. Thank you so much for that.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. Yeah, once again, appreciate your time spent with us today, and have a good day.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast. Please head to iTunes, rate, and provide honest feedback on the podcast. See you next week.